80 years ago, the United States did what was once deemed unthinkable. They dropped the atomic bomb, obliterating the Japanese city of Hiroshima. A few days later, they dropped another atom bomb on Nagasaki. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed in an instant, ushering in the end of the Second World War and the beginning of a new nuclear age, an age of global proliferation. Richard Overy is a British military historian and a World War II specialist. His latest book focuses on the nuclear bombing of Japan. Reign of Ruin gives us context about how the US came to be the first to use nuclear weapons. He also explores the lesser recognized policy of mass aerial destruction of Japanese cities with conventional bombs in the build-up to that era-defining moment. Overy's work is a deep dive into the motivations of war, as much as it is an account of historical events. His previous book, Why War, explores why conflict has been such a consistent presence throughout human history. On this episode of the InnerView, I'll speak to Richard Overy about both books, why he wrote them, why conflict still persists, and 80 years on since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, what kind of new insights he's gained about humanity's relationship with war. Thanks for joining us on the InnerView. He is one of our generation's greatest military historians, helps us understand the present and the past. Professor Richard Overy joins us now. Thanks for joining us, sir. I want to focus on Reign of Ruin, but also why war and beyond. And I wonder, since it's the 80th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the surrender of Japan and the end of World War II, did you write Reign of Ruin with that in mind? Did you feel that you wanted it to be that sort of this pillar in the sand of modern history to tie in with the anniversary?
Well, it was designed to tie in with the anniversary, and it has in fact generated a lot of interest. 80 years on, people are still fascinated by why the atomic bombs were dropped. But I tried with this book to focus on the bombing of Tokyo in March 1945 too, which resulted in the deaths of more than 80,000 people in 3 hours of bombing. These are very important anniversaries. I think it's to remind us just about what happens when warfare becomes radicalized.
Yeah, it's fascinating that you mentioned the firebombing of Tokyo as well in the build-up to it. I think a lot of people underestimate the amount of death and destruction that had occurred in the build-up to the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki with the atomic bomb. Why do you think, as a historian, why do you think that we focus only on what happened in August and not so much on what preceded that?
Well, I think the answer is quite straightforward, really, because the two atomic bombs heralded a complete step change in warfare. They've dominated the way we think about modern war ever since 1945. And that's what people think about, is what people worry about. But the conventional bombing of Japanese cities was much like the conventional bombing of German cities, much less newsworthy. It was something which had already happened. The atomic bombs were something which signaled the future.
When it comes to intentionality, I think the debate has continued for 80 years, right? When it comes to intentions, but also whether this was morally the right thing to do. You have people on the one hand, perhaps, who only look at the US dropping the atomic bomb on Japan and stripping it of context and seeing it as a war crime in and of itself, and those who say, well, this was the only thing that could have been done to force Japan to surrender and to end World War II. And do you find that both sides use the history instrumentally and cherry pick the zeitgeist and the context and the facts?
Well, they do. I mean, the problem is that, when you're writing this history, what you really got to do is explain why it happened. Why did they make that decision to drop two atomic bombs. This was a radical change, just like the firebombing of Japanese cities was a radical change in American strategy. And it's important for historians to explain it, I think, rather than simply judge it. I mean, there's no doubt that bombing Japanese cities and killing civilians in large numbers and the dropping of the two atomic bombs violated the norms of war. And the American leadership knew that, because in 1941, the American Air Force was committed to just attacking military targets precisely. By the end of the war, they were dropping an indiscriminate atomic bomb.
There seemed to be a little bit of uptick in interest in this with the movie Oppenheimer when it came out. I mean, so much so that my teenage daughter went with her friends to see Oppenheimer, and she had a lot of questions for me. I mean, I wasn't born in 1945. She had a lot of questions for me. She was Googling a lot, watching documentaries afterwards. What do you think of this sort of modern retrospective and the way people are viewing it now with this renewed attention, especially with regards Christopher Nolan's Hollywood adaptation of the mindset of those who were involved in Los Alamos in creating these bombs?
Well, I always think it's a very difficult thing to do, and I don't like many of the reconstruction movies for the Second World War for obvious reasons. I think that what's interesting about Oppenheimer is that his role in making sure there were bombs has, I think, often been underestimated, particularly as later he then became really opposed to what he'd done. But I think one of the things I've tried to convey in my book is just how important the scientists were. Without the scientists and engineers working flat out, 18 hours a day, discussing everything with each other, finding solutions to things, there would have been no atomic bomb. And we would be talking about the end of the war in a different way. And I think that the Oppenheimer movie conveyed something of that.
Yeah.
But really, when you look at the record of what they were doing, it's clear that the scientists played a critical role in making the atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki a possibility. And we shouldn't overlook that. One of the reasons why the bombs were dropped was because Oppenheimer's science committee recommended dropping them on the center of the city so that they could study what a bomb did. A cynical view, but I think that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to see exactly what a bomb would do.
And is that one of the reasons why they didn't drop the atomic bomb on cities that had already been decimated by the incendiary devices, the firebombs that they dropped previously earlier in the year?
Yes. No, they wanted LeMay, the commander of the bombing force, they wanted LeMay to leave a few cities because they wanted to be able to see exactly what impact an atomic bomb would have. If they dropped it on an incinerated city, a city already subject to firebombing, they wouldn't have been able to tell very much. And straight away, once the war was over, scientific teams arrived in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. British and American teams arrived to evaluate exactly what an atomic bomb did in order to understand what they would need to do if they were ever faced with that threat.
That's fascinating. I mean, so just one fact check from Oppenheimer, and something that disturbed me when watching the film, and I couldn't know for sure whether this was apocryphal or and just maybe dramatic or artistic license, or if it actually happened. There's a scene with Secretary of War Stimson, who says, no, not Kyoto. My wife and I visited, and we love that place. It's a beautiful old city, whether they went for their honeymoon or whatever. And that was, according to the movie, that was the reason why Kyoto was taken off the table and Nagasaki was put on the table. Was that true?
No, completely apocryphal. It's true he visited Kyoto many, many years before, but his explanation to Truman about why he wanted Kyoto taken off the list was that Kyoto was the historic, cultural and religious city in Japan, the most important historic city in Japan. And Stimson said, if we're going to occupy Japan in a few months' time, we don't want to build up their resentment by destroying, for them, their most important historic city. And so Kyoto was taken off the list for basically expedient reasons.
Was it their intention to only drop those two bombs, or was there more to it? Because I know that sometimes what we do is we sort of look back retrospectively and think that that was the plan all along. But the evidence doesn't seem to bear that out, does it?
Well, of course, it was difficult to plan anything until they were certain that the bombs would be available, and both bombs, both types of bomb, the uranium bomb and the plutonium bomb, it was very clear by late 44, early 45 that they would be ready. But what the American Air Force actually planned, of course, was nuclear war, not just dropping bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but on a range of other cities as well. Indeed, they thought at the beginning that Hiroshima would need 3 bombs to destroy it. It didn't need 3, of course, it only needed 1. But then they had plans, if the Japanese didn't surrender, to go on dropping atomic bombs on Japanese cities all the way through September, October, November, December, as the bombs came off the production line. So, we have to see Hiroshima and Nagasaki not just as 2 unique events, but as the opening for what the Americans imagined they would be doing, waging nuclear war against Japan.
There's something that you've explored previously, and I wonder if we can double click on that for a second, is the way in which the American public and the media saw the bombing of Dresden differently to what they were doing in Japan, and how they experienced it and judged the 2 differently. Just tell us a bit more about that, if you will.
Well, it's very interesting because Dresden, in fact, happened only a couple of weeks before the firebombing of Tokyo. And there was some protest in America because a mistake at Eisenhower's headquarters. Somebody had said that they were bombing Dresden because it was full of refugees. And there was this sense that perhaps that they were really killing civilians. But a few weeks later, the American media was enthusiastic about the bombing of Tokyo. Evidence of 16 square miles of the most densely populated city in the world, where 83,000 people were killed, didn't arouse any opposition at all, as far as I can find. Because I think in the end, the American public and American leadership treated the Germans and the Japanese differently in racial terms.
So I look back at those cartoons, the World War II cartoons, the propaganda cartoons. There's a lot of sort of, the racial caricatures of the Japanese that you don't really find with the Germans. The Germans, I think Hitler just sort of absorbs the evil as an individual character. Do you think that it was mainly because of a cultural affiliation still with the Germans, even though they were Nazis, and a greater racism to the Japanese?
Yeah, I mean, there is, of course, some affinity, and of course, millions of Germans, former Germans living in the United States. Yeah. It's, I think, because yes, here were, fellow, white Westerners and so on who'd gone off track with Hitler. And in fact, it was only right at the end of the war when they uncovered Bergen-Belsen, for example, the terrible death camp, that views in America sharpened against the Germans. But by that stage, of course, it wasn't necessary even to think about dropping an atomic bomb on Berlin. By that stage, Germany almost reached the point of surrender.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I wonder, you'd written 23, 24 books before this one. As you delved into the research process of this book, you'd already known a lot about World War II, a lot about the context, a lot about the history. You'd written many of the major texts related to this. What did you learn during this process? What took you by surprise while writing Reign of Ruin?
Well, I think the most important thing was something I've referred to already, actually. I think it was the extent to which the scientists and engineers who were producing the bomb were determined to produce the bomb and determined to see it used, and to see it used in the way it was, dropped on the center of a city. And I think that I knew about the firebombing of Japanese cities and so on. I knew about the shift in American strategy and so on. But I think it's the extent to which the atomic bombs, owed their final existence to the efforts of the scientific community. But scientists, I think, on the whole, get away with quite a lot in producing, terrible weapons. They produce them, hand them over to the military use them, it's the military who get the blame. But scientists who work on these things also have, I think, a very important responsibility for developing weapons which they know, as in this case, will violate in the end the norms of war.
Right. Let's take a little pivot now and go to the book preceding Reign of Ruin, Why War? You're asking the big question. I mean, this is something that philosophers, sociologists, politicians, religious leaders, people have been asking forever and ever, a lot of the time with the wrong answers. What's interesting with the book is you divide it into sort of two parts, and the one goes very deep. So it's sort of anthropology, biology, psychology, ecology, if I remember correctly. And then the other part is the stuff that influences us in a more sort of imminent sense, right? The politics, the resource wars,
Yeah.
the big leaders and so on. So firstly, why did you write Why War?
Well, I wrote it, I was prompted partly by working some years ago on a conversation between Albert Einstein and Sigmund Freud, when the League of Nations asked Einstein to choose somebody and to ask a big question. And he chose Freud, and he asked why war, hoping that Freud would be able to give him an answer, because he assumed that war had a psychological root. Freud gave him a very depressing answer, basically saying there was no way of stopping war. Human beings were capable of violence just like animals. But what interested me was the way in which, since then, the major sciences, the major human sciences, have tried to engage with this big question, why war? And they've got a wide variety of different answers. But it's something which modern human sciences engage with a lot in trying to explain something which is fundamental to the human condition.
Right. And when we look at it again, and as you've sliced it into two, you've got the deep-rooted stuff that I guess we could say is hardwired into us as biological beings, or the other stuff, power, resources, belief, and so on. Where do you land on this one after having written the book?
Well, I mean, they're both important. That's what I've tried to highlight. I think that those historians and sociologists and anthropologists who look back and say, actually, war is really only something which happens when the state occurs. So, we're looking at a few thousand years ago. I'm much more influenced by the way in which evolutionary scientists, excuse me, biologists and psychologists have both tried to find the roots of violence going much further back. And I think it does go further back. It's hard to imagine that for 200,000, 300,000, 400,000 years, hominins didn't find reasons at times to fight each other. And indeed, we do have enough archaeological evidence to show that it certainly predates the development of states. Oh. And so I wanted to look at what they say about it, and how they explain why it is that human beings became such a belligerent species, so much more belligerent than any other species, right. Capable in the end, of course, of developing through the state the apparatus of modern war, right. where you can organize large armies and kill very large numbers of people. And, so the two go together. Right. By the time we get to the historical period, the important thing, of course, is what are our motives? And I've tried to separate out what I regard as the three or four most important.
Okay, and so the three. So let me connect this to the previous conversation, and then we'll look a bit more deeply at motivations. So we've been speaking about the firebombing of Tokyo, for example, the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That was the first and last time that the atomic bomb was used. Now we have multiple nations with thousands of nuclear weapons. Given your understanding of our warlike nature, do you believe that it's likely that we will have nuclear war, given that we're not living in 1945, where only one country had this kind of diabolical weapon?
Well, I'm often asked this question. And my answer usually is no, we won't see nuclear war. Just for the simple deterrent reason that both sides know that in a nuclear exchange, nobody wins. If you've got some kind of super defense, which is going to stop your enemy's missiles and so on arriving, well, maybe that situation will change. But I think for the moment, nuclear warfare, however much people talk about it, threaten it and so on, there is a natural deterrent effect. That doesn't stop and hasn't stopped conventional warfare, often on a very large scale. It hasn't stopped conventional warfare now in the 2020s. But I think the prospect of waging nuclear war, I think, is very unlikely. I'm an historian, of course. I can't predict the future, but that's my view.
I mean, sometimes it feels as if mutually assured destruction, the MAD or MAD theory, is a belief in itself, a hopeful belief of all of us that it doesn't happen, right? Because the consequences are just unimaginable.
Yeah, well, it's quite bizarre, in fact, to have weapons which are capable of massive destruction. In fact, if they're all fired, they destroy the globe, more or less, and still to retain them, knowing you're not going to use them. The answer, of course, is really to get rid of them all, and to recognise that was a step too far. It always exists as a threat, and I think we shouldn't underestimate that. And in the hands of a hubristic, irrational leader, well, who knows what might happen. But at the moment, my view of the 21st century is we won't see nuclear war.
In a previous interview, I think it was with Jeffrey Sachs, really enjoyed listening to that, you mentioned at the end that you were working on a new book that's on Adolf Hitler himself. And to go back to the issue of intention, I want to ask about collective intention versus individual intention, and whether the dog wags the tail or the tail wags the dog. And this has been discussed. I discussed it with Anthony Beaver as well, about the idea of the singular individual, the strong man, and the fact that you're writing a book about Hitler. Clearly, his personality, the force of nature that he was, as evil as he was, clearly had a certain impact. He wasn't just the product of his circumstances. Where do you land on that, given that you're writing a book about Hitler and he's the central figure in World War II, and much of what has flowed downstream from that are the circumstances creating the individual still, or are the individuals creating the circumstances?
Well, it's always a balance. Of course, I always see it as a balance. I mean, in my book By War, I focus on a particular kind of power seeking, whether it was Hitler or Napoleon or Alexander the Great or Genghis Khan, you might look at. There are leaders who see war as the solution rather than a problem, and they drive on to more war, more war, more war. And in the end, you do it because they have the power to be able to do it and compel other people. Other people follow them in the belief that that what they're doing is right. So yes, occasionally you do get a figure, a power political figure like that, who does exert an extraordinary influence on the circumstances with which he's surrounded. I should say that I'm not writing a book biography of Hitler. There are too many of them, and I have nothing much to add. I think I'm writing a book about why we are so fascinated by Hitler 80 years on, why Hitler features in so many diverse areas. Why Hitler is a reference point, whether we're thinking about evil, whether we're thinking about leadership. Why is it that he features so much in modern culture and so on? What is it about Hitler?
Right.
Unlike other dictators, that makes us still fascinated by him.
Yeah, when we compare the death tolls, I mean, if you put Hitler and Stalin next to each other, it's not too dissimilar, or even, arguably Mao, I think, as well. So it's true. There is a reason to write that book, and it is fascinating to understand why we have this, particular fascination with him. Because we're running out of time, I want to ask you, I want to bring this back to the present and tap into your wisdom a little bit to help answer a question that a lot of people are asking in these very turbulent times. So they see the war crimes and the atrocities in Gaza, and they see horrendous killing in Ukraine and Sudan and beyond. And there's almost a feeling that a lot of people have that this is unusual, that we're living in tremendously turbulent times that are somewhat qualitatively different from what came before. As a historian who studies us butchering each other, answer that for me.
Well, of course, we are living in turbulent times. Turbulent times have characterized much of the 20th century. And you couldn't, of course, get more turbulent than the First and Second World Wars. These are huge, huge historical events by comparison. I think the problem is that in the West, we've lived in a kind of bubble for a long time, of security, growing prosperity, and so on. And we've tried to ignore what's going on in the wider world. But actually, the wider world out there remains turbulent. There are plenty of trouble spots. There are plenty of wars to come, I'm afraid to say. What we need to be able to do is to find a way to calm politicians and political leaders down, get them to think a little bit about how important peace is, perhaps rather than thinking all the time that war is around the corner.
Okay, I think that's a good point at which to end this discussion. Richard Overy, I thank you so much for joining us on the interview.